What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Anecdotes and Observations. That's AO, pronounced AO. And this is part 2 of my discussion with Mike Tuchscherer, Greg Nuckols, and Bryce Lewis, where we're going to be talking about other aspects of emerging strategies. In this episode, we get a little more constructive in our discussion, talking about how each one of us uses systematic approaches to individualization, and we find the similarities between our methods. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for tuning in.
One thing I think is there's a range, a probably wide range and maybe narrow as an athlete gets more developed and more elite, but there's a probably wide range of programs, plural, that an athlete can respond really well to. And if an athlete is making progress, we're probably not going to be searching the field too wide for what can be making more progress.
Yeah.
Athletes making progress, fantastic. But that's true of any system, really. That's not like an emergent strategies thing.
Well, I think that would be an interesting thing to know at some point is, like, for a given, say, Wilks score, what's a reasonable rate of gain for that person, just on the average. And of course, that gets individualized too. Some people are
born with the 460 Wilks. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, and then get stronger rapidly, and then some people just don't.
Yep.
So
I can send you a data set if you want to look into that.
Yeah, that would be cool.
You can just go on Open Powerlifting, download everything, filter based on the criteria you want. So maybe only drug tested feds or only IPF affiliates, and then sort alphabetically. See how many people show up in the database multiple times, and then calculate rates of progress.
Yeah.
And you can see kind of at various levels of strength how that changes.
Yeah, I think that would be cool to know that,
So one potential limitation of this strategy that I think may be not necessarily unique to it, but maybe isn't present in more common strategies, is I'm not entirely sure how you'd account for second order effects. So let's say you run a developmental cycle. It's a type 3 response. Doesn't look like it's going all that well. Run a pivot block. Go to another developmental cycle. It's a type 1 response. Looks like it's awesome. Very potentially, something in that first developmental cycle could have potentiated the second one.
Yeah.
And now you've got periodization.
Yeah. And it... I think if you're using, a block periodization paradigm, and you have, volume blocks and intensity blocks, and you see, if I run an intensity block after a volume block, it does really well, but if I run 2 intensity blocks back-to-back, the second one doesn't do that great. So it seems like the volume block is potentiating the intensity block. If you have a decent number of developmental cycles in the mix, how would you be able to tease that out without not just running a fair amount of developmental cycles, but running the same one 3 or 4 times?
Well, kind of the reason that I started calling this emerging strategies was because it starts with small. You start with the microcycle. Let's figure out the volumes, intensities, and so on that you respond well to. But in theory, you should be able to go up from there. Once we've got that sorted, we should be able to figure out the next level and the next level, and eventually, a long-term plan that is optimized to an individual. Now, that's not going to happen because by the time you figure that out, it's the Theseus's ship problem,
Yeah.
But I think, also what's going on to figure any of this out with any sort of degree of certainty, because there's no control group or anything like that going on. So you're taking a Bayesian approach to your certainty levels. You try once and floor presses look like they did awesome. Well, that's one time, So the next trial, I don't know, that one didn't go so well. So it's the more data points that you get on floor press, the more certain you can be of it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, hopefully once you've kind of established that smaller cycle, then you can start to figure out how the sequences fit together. But it is a lot more difficult to move up a level.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's relatively easy, I think, to figure out what's going on at that first level. But to move up a level and figure out the ideal sequence of blocks. And there's other things that are kind of counterintuitive that I would place in that second level as well. And they're not coming to mind right now, which is convenient. But
it's been a long day.
Things like template changes and stuff like that, like that's really at that second level as well. Because if you change the template but you're using a bunch of exercises and intensities that aren't going to produce results for you, then you're probably not going to see anything anyway, you know. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a limitation to it, that you're not going to get kind of that mid or long term plan that's like perfectly figured out. I mean, can you get that anyway? Like maybe on the average, but I don't think that there's a rejection of exercise science in it. You know, that what we learn from exercise science informs, like fills in those gaps that we don't know from individualized data yet. And I think that makes it a really reasonable place to start most of the time.
So one of the things, like I think the approach does well, and maybe even one of the reasons to think about it in the first place is like, you know, look, we don't want the Soviet model, we don't want a long-term model, we don't even, like, why assume that a 4-week / deload, or 4 week followed by deload, followed by 4 week followed by deload with increased intensity works for everyone? It might be a good place to start, but why would we assume that in the first place? So let's start with kind of first basic principles. I really like that idea, but at some point we have to put down on paper what we think the athlete is going to be doing in the gym. I'm telling them what to do in the gym. We have to tell them, okay, how often do I want you to squat, to bench, to deadlift? So like, what is this basic building block that we're starting off with? And you've chosen the microcycle or the week. But even within that, you've decided based on some intuition or athlete history or your experience working with the athlete. Okay, I think the athlete is going to squat, bench, and deadlift X, Y, and Z times, and I think this selection of exercises works best with them. So that's kind of where first basic principle steps off, and coach comes in and says, "This is the plan for now until we have better information."
Yeah. And I think that's a great spot where, you know, we can say, well, you know, the data shows that, you know, this frequency works best, or you know, for most people most of the time, and you know, I've done a little dabbling with some other things like 80% rep tests and stuff like that to try to get a little bit better starting point, you know. But it was interesting to me to look at that type of data and see how many exceptions there are, you know. Like, yeah, there's an overall trend, but there's so many exceptions. You know, you may just be one of those exceptions, you know. But I guess it's
I think a lot more people are exceptions than realize. Like
on the whole, right?
Yeah,
nobody's average at everything.
Yeah, like I think people underestimate just variability. Period. Like if there's something that works best on average, you know, I think a lot of people interpret that as this is the best thing for 90% of people, whereas it might be the best thing for 30% of people and works well enough for the other 70% that they don't drag down the average.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and I think I think the difference and any critique or hesitation I have around your system is not actually the system, but it's actually the starting point, which is not an issue with the framework. Now, the more I think about it, if you're starting with the pen light somewhere closer to the mouth of the cave, I think I'm just comfortable and more confident starting somewhere that I think would be a little bit better for most people. Like I might have a volume and then a intensification block with some form of undulation and a little slightly different exercise selection, because through my personal coaching history, I've seen that it hits the vast majority of people, and then from there I adjust, because I'm trying to think back through my own coaching career, and something that falls in that range seems to work for, at least in my experience, like 90% of people.
Yeah, I think so the reason I asked about second order effects is I think that our general approach isn't all that different. But I started with a framework that seems to capture those second order effects on average for most people, and then kind of work back and kind of work on fixing the first level stuff from there.
Well, let me kind of turn a question around that you guys asked me. So one thing that I've done no more than a handful of times now is I end up finding one of these athletes that doesn't respond so well to high intensity, the classic powerlifting peaking thing, and responds much better to lower intensity. So we'll go into the meet with those low intensity blocks, and it seems to work well. In the frameworks that you guys use, can you arrive at that conclusion?
I think so. So the way I tend to set things up is I'll have 3 very similar 4 to 6 week blocks, but the first block's a little lighter, second block's a little heavier, third block's a little heavier, and just basically see how squat, bench, and deadlift responds for that lifter in each of those 3 blocks. And so, like, let's say deadlift does really good with lower intensity, bench does better with middle intensities, squat does better with higher intensities. Then from there, what I tend to do is like just build kind of a 6 week block of training that's going to have lower intensity deadlifts, moderate intensity bench, higher intensity squats, some variation in there, but that's kind of where that like block lives, and then just run it back to back for a long time. And still like iterating from there, but kind of having a framework I work with on the front end, and then once I run through that test, kind of using the data from that test to optimize for that lifter.
It's funny because it sounds like, I have this framework and I'm like, man, can you guys believe this? This is so cool. And you're like, yeah, I've been doing that.
Well, I mean, we all have systems for like parsing data and trying to figure out what's best for the athlete. Like I was thinking, one way I arrived at is similar to what Greg said, is starting off with a lighter block, and if you find that like the weights are getting heavier week to week, and the athlete is reporting lower and lower lasted RPEs, like this is a great training response. So you kind of just couch that in the back of your head and be like, okay, that's cool. Let's go on with things as normal, and then if things start to get worse over time, you notice, all right, well, things are getting worse over time. And it's note taking, but just in a different way that you said. But real quick before I pass it on, I'm trying to think like, okay, where can I meet Mike, and where's the similarity between what we're doing? And I'm thinking like, if I have a 4-week version of an emerging strategies thing, like that's perfect for me. I get 4 weeks of periodization. I can test out a strategy for kind of an extended period of time. So like, I realize like that's where I'm comfortable. It's kind of like basically just a slightly more periodized version of what you're already doing. So do a 4-week thing, see how things go over that period of time, evaluate what things are like, then decide, okay, what are the broad brushstrokes of what I want to change and stuff like that.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback, I think back in 2013 or 14, I sat down and I wrote 10 programs of different levels of volume. Jokingly, we called them Helmsco. Of basically different relative volume loads of the big 3 with kind of 8-week blocks, essentially. And that was basically the framework for what became my training system. And the cool thing about having Bryce here is that Bryce not only have I got to work with him since 2010, but he's got to work with me since 2010. And he remembers back to when I just told him to do Shaiko to be modified way back in the day, to then when I started giving him West Side-ish inspired things I actually wrote, to then having RTS inspired RPE training, to then probably for the last 4 or 5 years, basically playing his greatest hits, much like you do, but coming out of those 8-week Helmsco templates that I wrote that I then use in the same way you guys are talking about to go like moving them up or down that ladder and seeing what works better, and then obviously making a lot of other individual adjustments. So it is less systematic than what you're doing, just because I know I don't use the same tools as you, and I think I would like to think I make up for that by starting somewhere further down the cave, but that's completely based on my assumptions and where I've been before.
Well, there's something that you've said a number of times today, and you said it just in this conversation, is paying attention.
Yep.
You know, and something that you talked about earlier today was, like, how do you know when you're actually paying attention? But that's what this comes back to me, is like, this is a framework that facilitates paying attention. And it sounds like you guys all have frameworks for paying attention, and how do you figure this out? Like, well, you look and you use your head and you figure it out, you know. It sounds like that's kind of the central theme, maybe. And you know, you mentioned John Kiley during your talk today, and that's one of the big things that I've taken from listening to him, is that paying attention is more important than any of the planning that goes into it.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. The plan is the one that adapts to the athlete.
Yeah.
For sure.
So I thought this would be cool to do because Mike has been gracious enough to expose himself to our potential criticisms. I think it's much easier to criticize something's blind spots than to potentially be constructive and figure out how it could be improved. So I'll put it to myself as well, so I don't just get to be the moderator who always looks smart, or at least isn't exposed to criticism. Bryce and Greg, can you guys think of any ways which, even if we don't know whether we have the technology to support it, because it sounds like you can do some cool shit, are there ways that you see to improve upon what Mike's doing?
I think so. So, one, I am very much on board with almost everything you do, except for the lack of peaking. That's the part I find the most counterintuitive, and that's also the part that seems to be the most testable within your framework. And I think that's also kind of the most obvious second order effect that you could potentially tack on for added benefits. So like if there's a developmental block that is consistently working well for a lifter, you could, rather than running a pivot block after it, try out different peaking ideas to see if you can like get a further elevation above that. And that strikes me, and I could be totally full of shit, and you could be totally right, that peaking doesn't accomplish anything, and if you time the meet to where they reach their peak form within a developmental block that's as good as they're going to get, I just don't think that's right, though. I think there is something to peaking, and I think that peaking is something that would naturally fit into your system. That would be kind of a small enough kind of addendum to a block that already works well that it would be testable. Yeah,
and totally agree. I think that the non-peaking way of doing it, so the idea is just, if you know that your time to peak in a training block is 6 weeks, then you put the meet on the 6th week and you work backwards from there, and that's how you figure out the start, and you rest 2 or 3 days prior and don't really do much taper. You train normally up to that point. But you're right that's a reasonable place to start if you don't know anything else about them, because I think the peaking or the traditional tapering lends itself to more noise in the system, especially early on, when you maybe don't know that much about the athlete. But you're absolutely right that that's something that's pretty easily testable and potentially beneficial. And if you can figure out what exercises they're going to respond best to in a development cycle, there's no reason you can't figure out what type of taper strategy would work well.
To that point, by the way, have you found that time to peak is like a durable quality for fives as it is for singles?
Yeah.
So like that's just kind of like a quality that exists for athletes. Like whether I have singles at 8 or sets of 5 at 8, it's kind of a similar time before we start seeing a drop off in performance.
It seems to be, which is kind of weird.
It's kooky.
You know, there does seem to be a small range, right? So for me, my time to peak is around 6 exposures. It might be 5, it might be 7, you know, but it doesn't seem to be tied to anything in particular.
I don't think that's all too kooky when I think about it. Given our metric for what performance is always the same. We're trying to look at basically our estimated 1RM. We're kind of looking at the same quality each time. And if we accept some of the conceptual models like fitness fatigue and things like that, I would think that kind of makes sense to me. Like, you know, we're doing enough to produce overload, which means we're also producing some kind of fatigue. We're trying to get the same outcome each time, so you would think we'd have a roughly similar time to, at least in a stable person's life, right? All else being equal, we should see that. So I think that makes sense, and I think that's actually kind of cool. And I also actually had the same exact thought as Greg. Like, that was also one of the things. I think I brought that up to you.
You did.
Last year. I was like, look, man, tapers work, okay? You know, like,
well,
yeah.
To be honest, like that conversation from last year has stuck out in my head the whole year. Yeah. And there have been multiple times when I have an athlete that's coming into a competition, and if things don't look like they're progressing just how they normally would, you know, and you're just going to cruise right into this peak, then we'll implement a taper strategy to try to help it along.
Sure.
And like I mentioned in the talk yesterday, that the additional stress, the additional weight manipulation, everything that goes into a competition block, it seems like 50-50. You know, sometimes athletes seem to handle it and cruise right in. Other times they need it. You know, and then you have some athletes that just recover pretty poorly. Mm-hmm. And for them, I feel like it just makes sense, you know. Yep. But absolutely, it's something that's testable.
Yep. Do you have anything else, Bryce, on that point?
I was trying to think off, like, what's my checklist of what's important in training? Like, you have periodization. It's just, it happens when you switch to a pivot, or when you switch to a peaking block or something like that. Or when you switch from one development cycle that looks like XYZ to another one. That's periodization in the same way that someone would have an 8-week block and a different 8-week block down the line.
Yeah.
Which kind of takes care of some of the variation in strain, because there's some variation as the year goes on. Plus, I think the research on periodization was like a small effect size. Like, it's not massive anyways.
Depends how you slice it.
On elite athletes, I think it was bigger.
There's no research on elite athletes.
People who are not untrained.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's an accurate way to describe it.
Sure. We've got a metric to assess if an athlete's getting better. We have a coach who hopefully has a system of being able to see when that's happening. Responsive athletes as well. Like, and this is something that conceivably you could apply to any training approach. So I think I'm more on the same page with you than I thought I was like a month ago or even a few weeks ago as well, after like kind of seeing like, what are the pieces actually here.
Well, I think also I bear some responsibility, like you guys were talking about bristling at the idea in the beginning. I bear some responsibility for that because the way I couched it in the beginning is kind of this anti-periodization.
Periodization is dead.
Right.
My name is Mike T. And I'm going to kill it.
And it's not that, right? And the more I think about it, the more, like, yeah, there are limitations to it, but and that's maybe a reason to go toward a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach. But it's still planning training. It's just from a different vantage point. And I think maybe my reasons for going this direction are more epistemological rather than anti-periodization, which that's where I tried to focus, and I think I'll continue to try to focus now, is just, to me, it's more about how do I know what I think I know,
right?
And can I really support what I think?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a decent place to finish. I want to really thank you for taking the time and exposing yourself to criticism. I think that's an admirable quality, and I think we're probably all better for it. I know I've learned a lot this weekend, and it's always just fun to talk about this stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, and if this is on YouTube, I know that at least 90% of you have already left. So for the 10% of you who are here, you win. Thank you for staying around, and I will see you next time on AO!